At 69, she bought the house everyone fled. Her German Shepherd found what they all missed. Eleanor Whitaker arrived on the Oregon coast with a suitcase, a handful of old photographs, and a German Shepherd named Ranger. The house waiting for her stood alone above the Pacific, weathered by salt, wind, and decades of rumors. Locals called it the house nobody keeps. They said every owner eventually left. But on her very first night, Ranger stopped in a narrow hallway and stared at a wall as if someone, something, was still waiting behind it. If you had one chance to start over at 69, would you trust the warnings or trust your instincts? Let me know below. Eleanor Whitaker was 69 years old when she realized that a life could disappear one piece at a time without making much noise, not all at once, not in a fire, not in a flood, not even in a single terrible day. Sometimes it happened quietly, a signature here, a court ruling there, a phone call that lasted less than 3 minutes, a letter folded inside an envelope, and before you understood what had happened, 40 years of your life were packed into boxes. The bus rolled north along the Oregon coast beneath a sky the color of weathered steel. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Not hard rain, just enough to blur the world beyond the glass. Eleanor sat alone near the middle of the bus, one hand resting on the leash wrapped around her wrist. At her feet lay Ranger. The German Shepherd occupied more space than most passengers, but nobody seemed to mind. He was nearly 9 years old now, large and broad-chested, his black and tan coat flecked with silver around the muzzle. He slept with his head across Eleanor's boots. Every so often, one ear twitched, then settled again. The steady rhythm of his breathing was strangely comforting. For the last 18 months, Ranger had been the only constant thing in her life. Everything else had changed. She looked down at him and managed a faint smile. "You picked a strange retirement plan, didn't you?" she whispered. One brown eye opened briefly, then closed again. Outside, the Pacific appeared between stands of dark evergreen trees, gray water, white foam, black rocks. The ocean looked cold enough to hurt. Eleanor had always loved the sea. She wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps because it reminded her that the world was larger than any single disappointment. The thought stayed with her for a moment, then drifted away. Across the aisle sat a cardboard box sealed with packing tape. Inside were the things she had refused to leave behind. Family photographs, her husband's navy blue coffee mug, a Christmas ornament painted by her daughter when she was 7 years old, a small framed picture of Ranger as a puppy. The rest had been sold, given away, lost, or left behind. Some things were too expensive to move. Other things hurt too much to keep. Eleanor turned her gaze back toward the rain-covered window. 3 years earlier, she had believed she understood what the rest of her life would look like. She and her husband, Walter, had spent decades building a modest but comfortable life in Eugene. Nothing extravagant, a brick ranch house, a garden, summer barbecues, Sunday breakfasts, the ordinary things that become priceless when viewed from a distance. Then Walter died, a heart attack, sudden, without warning. One ordinary Tuesday morning, he was discussing tomatoes in the backyard. That afternoon, he was gone. The grief had been difficult enough. What came afterward proved worse. A commercial property investment Walter had entered years earlier turned out to be far more complicated than anyone realized. There were debts, partnership disputes, conflicting ownership claims, lawyers, court hearings. Months became years. The legal fees grew. The property collapsed in value. And eventually the house she and Walter had paid for, over nearly 4 decades, became collateral in a battle she never wanted. By the time it ended, there wasn't much left. Not enough to start over comfortably. Not enough to stay where she was. Just enough to buy one final chance. That was how Eleanor thought about it. One final chance. The bus rounded a curve. Ahead, a small coastal town emerged through the fog. A scattering of buildings, fishing boats, weathered storefronts. A church steeple rising above cedar rooftops. The sign near the highway entrance read, Windhaven Population 2, 814. The name sounded like something from an old novel. The bus pulled into a modest station beside a grocery store. When the doors opened, cold salt air flooded inside. Eleanor stood slowly. Her knees reminded her of every year she had lived. Ranger rose immediately, alert now, ready. The dog stretched, shook himself once, and waited patiently while she gathered her things. "Come on, partner." The word slipped out naturally. Walter used to laugh whenever she called Ranger that. The memory appeared suddenly, then vanished. Outside, the wind carried the distant cries of gulls, the smell of salt mixed with wet cedar and diesel fuel from the harbor below. It smelled different from Eugene. Older somehow, rougher, more honest. A man in his 50s waited beside a pickup truck near the curb. Tall, red beard, yellow rain jacket. When he saw Eleanor approaching with Ranger, he raised a hand. "Mrs. Whitaker? Eleanor is fine. I'm Tom Barlow." He shook her hand. His grip was firm but friendly. "The realtor asked me to drive you up." Tom glanced toward Ranger. Beautiful dog. Ranger studied him carefully, then relaxed. That seemed good enough for everyone. The drive took less than 15 minutes. They left the harbor behind and climbed a narrow road along the cliffs overlooking the ocean. The higher they went, the fewer houses remained. Soon only trees and coastline surrounded them. The Pacific stretched endlessly beyond the windshield. Tom drove quietly for a while. Then he cleared his throat. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. You really bought that place? The house?" "Yeah." Eleanor smiled. "I assume that's why we're driving there." Tom chuckled. Fair point. But something about the laugh felt uncertain, as though there was more he wanted to say. A few moments passed. Then he finally said it. "Folks around here call it the house nobody keeps." Eleanor turned toward him. "The house nobody keeps? That's the nickname." He shrugged. "Been that way for years." "What does that mean exactly?" Tom stared at the road. "No one stays. People move. Not like this." The answer hung between them. Not dramatic, not threatening, just matter of fact. Like a weather report. The truck rounded another curve. Then Eleanor saw it. The house stood alone on a bluff above the ocean. Weathered cedar siding, tall windows facing the sea, a steep roof darkened by decades of rain, a stone chimney rising above the trees. The property wasn't neglected exactly, but it wasn't loved either. The grass had grown wild in places. The paint needed attention. Several shrubs had become overgrown. Yet the structure itself remained solid, steady, watching. For a moment neither Eleanor nor Tom spoke. The ocean crashed against rocks far below, white waves exploding against black stone. Wind moved through the trees, and there it stood, waiting. Tom parked near the front gate. The engine clicked softly as it cooled. "You know," he said carefully, "the last owner made it 8 months." Eleanor looked at him. "The one before that?" He shook his head. 5, and before that." Tom gave a short laugh. "Not much longer." "Why?" He opened his mouth, closed it again, then finally shrugged. "No one ever seems to agree on that part." Ranger stepped out first. His paws touched the gravel. The dog immediately lifted his head and sniffed the air. Ocean salt, wet earth, pine, something else. Something Eleanor couldn't identify. He stood perfectly still, watching the house. Not barking, not nervous, simply watching. A long moment passed. Then Ranger started walking toward the front porch, as though he had already decided they belonged there. Eleanor followed. The wind tugged gently at her coat. She climbed the worn wooden steps, placed one hand on the railing, and looked out across the Pacific. The horizon seemed endless. Gray sky meeting gray water. No fences, no traffic, no neighbors in sight, just distance. For the first time in years, the knot that had lived inside her chest loosened slightly. Only slightly, but enough to notice. She couldn't explain it. The house was old, the future uncertain, the town unfamiliar. And yet, standing there beside Ranger, listening to the ocean below, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not happiness, not exactly. Something quieter, something cautious, like hope approaching from far away. Tom carried her boxes onto the porch. "You sure about this?" he asked. Eleanor looked once more at the house. The weathered cedar, the sea beyond it, the dog already waiting by the front door. Then she smiled, a real smile this time. "No," she said honestly, and after a pause she added, "But I think that's why I'm here." Far below, another wave crashed against the cliffs. The sound rolled upward through the fog, and somewhere inside the old house that nobody seemed able to keep, something waited patiently beyond her sight. Neither Eleanor nor Ranger knew it yet, but their story had already begun. The first night in the house was quieter than Eleanor expected. Not silent. Never silent. The Pacific had its own voice. Wind moved through the trees surrounding the bluff with a low, whispering sound. Waves crashed somewhere below the cliffs. The old cedar siding creaked occasionally as temperatures shifted after sunset. The sounds should have felt unsettling. Instead, they felt strangely alive. Eleanor slept on an air mattress in the living room because the upstairs rooms still needed cleaning. Most of her belongings remained packed inside boxes stacked against the walls. Ranger chose a spot near the front door, as always, close enough to watch the house, close enough to watch her. By dawn, pale gray light filtered through the salt-streaked windows. Eleanor opened her eyes and spent several seconds trying to remember where she was. Then she heard the ocean and remembered. The house, the bluff, the town called Windhaven. Her new life. The realization settled over her slowly, not comfortably, not painfully, just heavily, like a coat she would need time to grow accustomed to wearing. She sat up. Her back protested. Her knees followed. "Good morning to you, too," she muttered toward her joints. Ranger lifted his head immediately. His tail thumped once against the floor. The dog stretched long and low before walking over to her. Eleanor rubbed behind his ears. The familiar softness of his fur grounded her. There were still things in the world she recognized. That mattered. Outside, fog drifted across the bluff. The ocean had almost disappeared behind it. Only the distant sound of waves remained. After a quick breakfast of coffee and crackers from a cardboard box, Eleanor got to work. The front gate leaned badly to one side. The porch steps were covered with pine needles. One of the kitchen cabinet doors hung crooked. The house needed attention, not major repairs, just care. The sort of care that happens when someone stays. By mid-morning, she had cleared most of the porch. She swept dead leaves from the corners and pulled weeds from cracks between the stones leading toward the road. The work felt good, simple, honest. For the first time in months, she wasn't arguing with lawyers or sorting paperwork. She was simply fixing something. Ranger followed her everywhere. Occasionally, he wandered ahead to inspect bushes or investigate unfamiliar scents. Then he returned, always returning. Around noon, she paused to drink water and study the property. The house sat slightly higher than she realized yesterday. From the bluff, she could see fishing boats moving slowly across the water. The roofs of Windhaven clustered below. A church steeple, a marina, a scattering of smoke rising from chimneys. It looked peaceful from a distance, almost painted. Ranger suddenly stopped beside the house. His ears lifted, his body became still. Eleanor followed his gaze. Nothing. Just the side wall. Weathered cedar boards darkened by decades of rain. After a few moments, he relaxed and walked away. She thought little of it. Dogs noticed things people missed. A squirrel, a bird, the scent of another animal. Nothing unusual. By late afternoon, she decided she needed groceries. The refrigerator was nearly empty. The pantry completely empty. And crackers would not sustain either of them very long. Windhaven's main street consisted of fewer than 24 buildings. Most appeared decades old. A hardware store, a diner, a pharmacy, a bookstore, several fishing supply shops, and a bakery near the corner. The smell reached Eleanor before she opened the door. Fresh bread, cinnamon, butter, coffee. For a brief moment she simply stood there, breathing it in. The scent reminded her unexpectedly of Saturday mornings years ago, before everything became complicated, before loss developed a permanent address inside her life. A bell chimed overhead as she entered. A woman behind the counter looked up, mid-40s, dark hair tied back, practical eyes, the kind of face that immediately noticed details. "Afternoon," the woman said. "Afternoon." Passing through, the question sounded automatic. Small-town habit. Eleanor smiled. "Actually, I just moved here." The woman paused. "Not long. Just enough to notice." "Really? Really?" The woman poured coffee into a mug. "Where'd you land?" Eleanor hesitated. "The house on the bluff." The reaction was subtle, but impossible to miss. Not fear, not shock. Recognition. "Oh," the woman set down the coffee pot. "The Mercer place." "I guess so." A few customers glanced up from their tables, then quickly returned to their meals. Eleanor noticed. The woman extended her hand. "Claire Donnelly." "Eleanor Whitaker." They shook hands. Claire nodded toward Ranger, who sat patiently near the door. "Beautiful shepherd. He knows it." Claire laughed. The sound felt genuine. For a few minutes they talked about ordinary things. Weather, road conditions, the grocery store, which plumber to call. The kinds of conversations people have when trying to decide whether a stranger might eventually become a neighbor. Then Claire asked the question, "How long do you plan on staying?" The wording caught Eleanor's attention. Not if. How long? Eleanor smiled slightly. "I just got here." Claire returned the smile. But something unreadable remained behind it. "Fair enough." The conversation moved on. Yet Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that Claire wasn't really asking about moving plans. She was asking something else. Something everyone in town already seemed to know. When Eleanor finally left with groceries and a loaf of sourdough bread tucked beneath her arm, the afternoon fog had begun rolling back in. The road home disappeared into shifting gray curtains. The house emerged gradually from the mist as she approached. Standing alone, watching the sea, waiting. That evening she unpacked family photographs. Walter smiling beside a barbecue grill. Her daughter, holding a pumpkin nearly bigger than herself. Ranger as a gangly puppy, with ears too large for his head. She placed the frames carefully on the mantel. The gesture felt important. A way of claiming space. A way of telling the house that someone lived here now. Night settled across the bluff. The fog thickened. Wind pressed against the windows. The old cedar walls groaned softly. Not alarming. Just old, the sounds of a house adjusting itself. Eleanor sat reading beneath a lamp while Ranger slept nearby. Hours passed, then something caught her attention. Not a noise. The absence of one. She looked up. Ranger was no longer beside the couch. The dog stood near the back hallway, completely still, watching, his eyes focused on the floor. Or perhaps beneath it. Eleanor lowered her book. "What is it?" Ranger didn't move, didn't bark, didn't growl. He simply stared. After a long moment, he walked farther down the hallway, then stopped again, watching, listening. The behavior lasted less than a minute. Then he returned to the couch and lay down, calm, as if nothing had happened. Eleanor waited. Nothing else followed. The house creaked, the wind blew, the ocean rolled endlessly below the cliffs. Eventually, she returned to her book. But before turning the page, she glanced once more toward the hallway. The shadows remained still. Nothing moved. Nothing seemed unusual. Yet somewhere deep inside the old cedar house, a small feeling began to take root. Not fear, not yet. Just uncertainty. The kind that arrives quietly and stays. For several days, Eleanor convinced herself that Ranger's behavior meant nothing. Old houses made noises. She knew that. The cedar walls expanded and contracted with changes in temperature. Wind pushed against the structure from the ocean side. Pipes rattled. Floorboards shifted. There was always a reasonable explanation. At least, that was what she told herself. The trouble was that Ranger seemed unconvinced. The pattern began so gradually she almost missed it. Every evening, shortly before sunset, Ranger would leave whatever he was doing and walk toward the back hallway. He never ran, Never barked, never acted frightened. He simply went there, then stood still, watching, listening. Sometimes he sat, sometimes he remained standing, his ears pointed forward, his body completely alert. Then, after 10 or 15 minutes, he would return to normal as though nothing had happened. The first few times, Eleanor ignored it. The 7th or 8th time she started paying attention. By then, she had spent nearly 3 weeks in the house. The days had settled into a routine. Mornings were for repairs. Afternoons were for errands in town. Evenings belonged to the ocean. She had repaired 2 loose windows, replaced a broken latch on the back door, and cleared most of the weeds choking the stone pathway. The house looked better already. Not restored, but cared for. Sometimes she sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched fishing boats return to harbor through the fog. Other times she simply listened to the waves. The quiet was beginning to feel familiar, maybe even comforting. Yet Ranger remained focused on the hallway every single evening. One afternoon, Eleanor decided to test a theory. At precisely the same time Ranger usually became interested in the hallway, she walked there first. The dog followed. The hallway itself was narrow and unremarkable. One wall held several framed photographs left behind by previous owners. The glass was dusty and clouded with age. The opposite wall was plain cedar paneling painted cream decades earlier. The floorboards showed signs of wear. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. Eleanor stood there waiting. Ranger moved beside her, then he stopped. The dog's head tilted slightly, his nose lifted. He sniffed the air, once, twice. Then his attention locked onto a section of wall roughly halfway down the hallway. The exact same place as before. Eleanor stepped closer, ran her hand across the painted wood. The surface felt solid, cold, ordinary. "What are you hearing?" she asked softly. Ranger did not answer. He simply stared. The behavior lasted 10 minutes, then he walked away, leaving Eleanor alone in the hallway. She found herself staring at the wall long after the dog had lost interest. That night she dreamed about the house. Not a nightmare, just strange. In the dream she wandered through endless hallways, while ocean waves echoed somewhere beyond the walls. She woke before dawn with the sound of rain striking the roof. For several moments she lay still listening. The storm had arrived during the night, a serious one. Wind hammered the bluff. Rain rattled against the windows. Branches scraped the siding with sharp, irregular sounds. The house groaned around her. Ranger was awake, standing near the living room window, watching the darkness outside. His silhouette appeared almost black against the gray morning light. "Not exactly beach weather," Eleanor muttered. The dog glanced back briefly, then returned to his watch. The storm lasted 3 days. During that time, Windhaven seemed to disappear beneath layers of fog and rain. Roads flooded. Fishing boats remained docked. Most residents stayed indoors. Claire's bakery shortened its hours. The hardware store closed entirely for one afternoon after a tree came down nearby. By the 3rd day, even Eleanor began feeling trapped. The house felt smaller, the rooms darker, the ocean louder, and Ranger's strange routine became even more noticeable. Now he visited the hallway multiple times a day, not obsessively, but often enough to draw attention. One evening, Eleanor sat reading in the living room while rain lashed the windows. The clock on the mantel read 8:17. A sudden gust struck the house. The walls creaked. Somewhere upstairs a floorboard popped sharply. Ranger lifted his head. Eleanor barely looked up. The house had been making noises for hours. Then Ranger stood. Immediately, his entire posture changed. The movement was so sudden that Eleanor lowered her book. The dog walked toward the hallway. Fast, not running, but purposeful, focused. Something was different. She could feel it. The wind howled outside. Rain hammered the roof. Ranger reached the hallway and froze. His ears stood forward. Every muscle in his body tightened. Eleanor rose slowly from her chair. "Ranger?" The German shepherd did not move. For several seconds the only sound came from the storm. Then it happened. A low growl vibrated deep inside his chest. Not aggressive, not threatening, uneasy. The kind of growl dogs make when they cannot understand something. Eleanor felt a chill. The dog almost never growled, especially indoors. She approached carefully. The hallway seemed darker than usual. Shadows shifted as tree branches moved outside the windows. Ranger remained fixed on the wall, the same location. Then another sound emerged. Faint, almost impossible to hear. A metallic click, somewhere inside the house, or beneath it. Eleanor couldn't tell. She held her breath. The sound came again. A soft metallic tap, then silence. The storm continued raging outside. "Probably a pipe," she whispered. But the explanation sounded weak even to her. Ranger didn't seem convinced. The dog stepped forward, pressed his nose against the wall, then looked back at her, his eyes alert, questioning, as if asking whether she finally understood that something wasn't right. Eleanor knelt beside him, placed her hand against the painted cedar. The wood felt cold. Nothing more, no vibration, no movement, nothing. Yet she remained there longer than necessary, listening, waiting. The storm intensified. Thunder rolled somewhere offshore. Then lightning flashed. For a brief instant, the hallway illuminated bright white. The shadows vanished. Then darkness returned, and Ranger suddenly lunged forward. Not at someone, not at anything visible, at the wall itself. His paws struck the paneling, once, twice, then again, scratching furiously. The sound echoed through the hallway. Wood, claws, rain, wind, everything blending together. "Ranger," he ignored her. The dog continued scratching, not wildly, deliberately, at one specific section. His breathing became heavier, his tail stiff, his focus absolute. Eleanor had never seen him behave like this, not once, not in 9 years, not when strangers approached, not during thunderstorms, not during fireworks. Nothing. This was different, genuine, instinctive, urgent. She pulled him gently away from the wall. The dog resisted, not aggressively, but enough to make his point clear. Something had his attention, something powerful enough to overcome years of training. Finally, he backed away. Still staring, still listening. The hallway fell silent again. Only the storm remained. Eleanor stood there beside him, heart beating faster than she cared to admit. She looked at the wall, at the ordinary cream-colored paneling, at the spot Ranger had scratched. Tiny marks from his claws now scored the paint. The damage was minor, but it felt significant, like a message. For the first time since arriving in Windhaven, Eleanor stopped searching for easy explanations. Maybe it was the storm. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the certainty she saw in Ranger's eyes. Whatever the reason, a new thought entered her mind, and this time it refused to leave. What if the dog wasn't imagining something? What if there really was something there? Outside, another wave crashed against the cliffs below. The old house shuddered softly, and somewhere beyond the wall, hidden behind layers of cedar and paint and years of silence, something continued waiting. Eleanor barely slept that night, not because she was frightened. At least, that was what she told herself. Fear felt too dramatic, too young. She was 69 years old. She had buried a husband, sat through courtrooms, lost a home she thought she would die in. A scratching dog and a strange wall were hardly enough to scare her, but they were enough to keep her awake. The storm finally moved offshore sometime after midnight. By morning, the ocean had settled into a slow gray rhythm. Fog drifted across the bluff. Water dripped from the eaves. The world smelled washed clean. Ranger was already awake. He sat near the kitchen doorway watching her prepare coffee. Every few moments, his ears twitched toward the hallway. Not obsessively, just enough to remind her. Eleanor noticed, and so did he. "You're not letting this go, are you?" The German shepherd blinked, then looked toward the hallway again. Eleanor sighed. Neither of them mentioned it further. The next afternoon she drove into town. Officially, she needed paint supplies. Unofficially, she wanted answers. Windhaven looked different after the storm. Puddles reflected the cloudy sky. Fishing boats crowded the marina. Seagulls circled overhead, crying sharply. Life had resumed its ordinary rhythm. But Eleanor found herself studying faces, wondering who might know something, wondering who might be willing to talk. The first person she visited was Claire. The bakery smelled exactly as it always did: warm bread, cinnamon, coffee. The comforting scent reached the sidewalk before she even opened the door. Claire was arranging pastries behind the display case when Eleanor entered. The woman immediately noticed something. "You look like somebody who didn't sleep." Eleanor smiled. "That obvious?" "A little." Claire poured coffee without asking. Eleanor accepted the mug gratefully. For a few minutes they discussed weather and road conditions. Then Eleanor finally asked, "The house on the bluff?" Claire paused, only slightly. But Eleanor noticed. "What about it? People keep talking around it." "What do you mean?" "They tell me nobody stays there." Claire leaned against the counter. "That's true." "Why?" The woman considered the question carefully. Almost too carefully. "Depends who you ask. I'd like your version." Claire looked toward the front window. Outside, two fishermen walked past, carrying supplies. When they disappeared from view, she turned back. The house belonged to a man named Samuel Mercer. Eleanor recognized the name immediately. The Mercer place. Claire nodded. "Most people still call it that." "Who was he?" "A lighthouse engineer." Eleanor waited. Claire continued. "He worked at Cape Hollow Light for decades." The name meant nothing to Eleanor, but the way Claire said it suggested it mattered. "He was respected." "A good man?" "From what I've heard." Claire wiped the counter slowly. "Quiet. Intelligent. Kept mostly to himself." "What happened?" The woman's expression changed slightly. Not discomfort. Something closer to uncertainty. "His wife disappeared." The bakery seemed quieter suddenly. The sound of the espresso machine faded into the background. "When?" 1967, Eleanor frowned. "Disappeared how?" "During a rescue operation." "At sea?" Claire nodded. There was a storm outside. Wind rattled the front window. A coincidence, but an uncomfortable one. The official report said she was swept overboard. Official report? Claire noticed the wording. So did Eleanor. Neither commented on it. "People searched for weeks," Claire said. "They never found her." Eleanor took a sip of coffee. "And Samuel?" Claire gave a small shrug. "He changed. How? He became obsessed." The word hung between them. "He spent years asking questions." "Questions about what happened?" "About everything." Claire's voice lowered. "He didn't believe the story." Eleanor felt something tighten inside her. Not fear, interest. The kind that arrives when pieces begin aligning. What story? The official one. And what did he think happened? Claire shook her head. "Depends which version you hear." That answer stayed with Eleanor long after she left. Because it wasn't really an answer. It was an invitation. An unfinished sentence. And unfinished things had a way of bothering her, especially now, especially after Ranger. Over the next week, Eleanor asked more questions, carefully. Without announcing that she was investigating anything, people talked more freely when they believed they were simply sharing memories. An old fisherman at the marina remembered Samuel. A retired schoolteacher remembered Margaret. The owner of the hardware store remembered seeing Samuel walk through town carrying notebooks under his arm. Everyone remembered something, but nobody remembered the same thing. That was what struck Eleanor. The contradictions. Some described Samuel as brilliant. Others called him unstable. Some said grief consumed him. Others insisted he had never stopped searching because he knew something wasn't right. Every conversation seemed to end in uncertainty, as though the town had collectively decided decades ago to stop asking questions. One afternoon, Eleanor found herself sitting beside an elderly man named Walter Finch. Walter was 91, partially deaf, and apparently indifferent to social caution. They sat outside the marina, watching fishing boats unload their catch. Walter chewed peppermint candy while staring at the harbor. You bought Samuel's house. Not a question. A statement. I did. Walter nodded. Good. Eleanor waited. After nearly 30 seconds, he continued. House got a bad reputation. So I've heard. Walter snorted. People are lazy. The old man pointed toward the water. Something happens. Pause. Nobody understands it. Pause. They make up a story. Eleanor smiled slightly. What happened to Samuel? Walter looked toward the horizon. For the first time, his expression softened. He loved that woman, Margaret, the missing wife. Walter continued. Everybody knew it. What happened after she disappeared? The old man was quiet, long enough that Eleanor thought he might not answer. Finally he spoke. He never stopped looking. Looking for what? Walter glanced toward her. The truth. The answer sent an unexpected chill through her. Not because of what he said, because of how certain he sounded. No hesitation. No rumors, no speculation, just certainty. As though the matter had been settled in his mind decades earlier. What truth? Walter's eyes returned to the ocean. If he knew, he wouldn't have spent 20 years searching. Eleanor sat silently beside him, watching the waves, listening to gulls, thinking. That evening she returned home, carrying more questions than answers. The bluff was wrapped in fog. The house emerged from the gray like a memory. Still, waiting, Ranger met her at the door, tail wagging once, then immediately turning toward the hallway. Eleanor laughed despite herself. You really don't quit. The dog walked ahead, stopping exactly where he always stopped. The same section of wall, the same focus, the same unwavering attention. Eleanor stood beside him. The hallway was quiet, no scratching, no strange sounds, nothing. Yet something had changed, not in the house, in her. For weeks she had viewed Ranger's behavior as an oddity, a mystery, perhaps even a nuisance. Now it felt connected. Connected to Samuel, connected to Margaret, connected to stories that nobody seemed willing or able to finish. She placed her hand against the wall again. Cold paint, solid wood, silence. Then she noticed something she had never paid attention to before. A faint difference in the paint texture, not obvious, almost invisible. A subtle line running vertically beneath several layers of old paint, the kind of detail most people would overlook, including her, until now. Ranger immediately lifted his head, his ears pointed forward, alert, focused, as if he knew she had finally seen it. Eleanor traced the faint line with her fingertips. The hallway suddenly felt very still. Outside, the ocean rolled endlessly against the cliffs. Inside, the old house seemed to hold its breath. And for the first time since arriving in Windhaven, Eleanor stopped wondering whether something was hidden behind the wall. Now she was beginning to wonder how long it had been there, and why nobody had ever found it. Or perhaps, why nobody had stayed long enough to try. Eleanor stood motionless in the hallway. The faint seam remained visible beneath the layers of paint. Now that she had seen it, she couldn't unsee it. The line extended from waist height almost to the floor, subtle, carefully hidden, but undeniably there. Ranger sat beside her, watching, waiting. The same way he had waited for weeks, the same way he had stared at this exact spot every evening. Outside, wind moved through the trees on the bluff. The ocean rolled steadily below the cliffs. Inside the house, everything felt strangely still. Eleanor pressed her fingertips against the seam. Nothing happened. No hidden mechanism, no movement, just painted wood. But something about it felt deliberate, as if somebody had worked very hard to make sure nobody noticed. The next morning she drove into town. Not for groceries, not for coffee, for tools. The hardware store occupied a corner building near the marina. Its wooden floors creaked beneath every step. Rows of tools lined the walls. Buckets, ladders, paint, lumber. The comforting smell of sawdust lingered in the air. The owner, a broad-shouldered man named Frank Holloway, looked up from a register. "Morning, morning, what can I help you with?" Eleanor hesitated, then smiled. "I need a pry bar," Frank laughed. "That usually means one of two things." "What's that?" Either you're renovating, he pointed toward the tool rack, or you're about to discover something. Eleanor wasn't sure how to answer that. By mid-afternoon, she stood back in the hallway, pry bar in hand, Ranger already positioned beside the wall. The dog seemed unusually alert, almost impatient. "You know something I don't you?" His ears twitched, that was all. Eleanor examined the panel more carefully. The seam continued behind a narrow section of trim. The trim itself looked slightly newer than the surrounding wood. Not recent, but newer. Different nails, different paint texture, different age. The sort of detail nobody notices until they're looking for it. She carefully inserted the edge of the pry bar beneath the molding. The wood resisted, then loosened. A faint cracking sound echoed through the hallway. Paint separated. Dust drifted into the air. Ranger immediately stood, tail rigid, eyes fixed on the wall. Eleanor removed another section, then another. The work took nearly an hour. Slow, patient, methodical. By the time she stepped back, a narrow rectangular outline had emerged. A concealed panel, not a wall, a door. Her pulse quickened. She stared at it for several seconds, then laughed quietly. Not from amusement, from disbelief. "Well, Ranger." The German Shepherd moved closer. "The house definitely wasn't built the way I thought." The panel had no visible handle, no lock, nothing obvious. Only a tiny brass latch recessed into the wood near the bottom corner. Nearly invisible beneath decades of paint, Eleanor brushed away dust. The brass gleamed faintly. She pulled. At first, nothing happened. Then a soft click echoed inside the wall. The panel shifted, just slightly. A breath of cool air emerged from the darkness beyond. Old air, dry air, air that had not circulated freely in years, maybe decades. The opening widened slowly. Wood rubbed against wood. The sound carried through the hallway. Ranger stepped forward immediately, his nose working furiously. Eleanor held the panel open, then froze. Beyond it lay a narrow corridor. Not a room, not a closet, a passage. The beam of her flashlight disappeared into darkness. The corridor extended behind the walls of the house, running parallel to the hallway, hidden completely from view. For a moment, neither Eleanor nor Ranger moved. The discovery felt impossible. Yet there it was, real, solid, waiting. The passage was barely 3 feet wide. Its walls consisted of unfinished framing lumber. Dust coated everything. Cobwebs stretched across corners. The smell reminded Eleanor of old attics and forgotten basements. Dry wood, aged paper, time itself. Ranger entered first, slowly, cautiously. His nails clicked softly against the floorboards. Eleanor followed, flashlight in hand. The beam swept across the narrow space. Electrical wiring, old ventilation ducts, support beams, maintenance access routes. The kind of structural spaces most homeowners never see. Yet someone had clearly used this area. Not recently, but repeatedly. A narrow shelf ran along one wall. Several rusted hooks protruded from the framing. At one point, she found the remains of an old lantern hanging from a nail. Farther ahead, footprints remained visible in thick dust, not fresh, ancient, preserved. Eleanor crouched beside them. The impressions appeared human. Large boots, worn soles. Heading deeper into the passage, Ranger continued moving ahead. The flashlight reflected in his eyes. The corridor seemed larger than the dimensions of the house should allow. It turned once, then again. Passing behind rooms Eleanor had already explored. Rooms that suddenly felt different. Because now she understood someone had once moved through the walls surrounding them. Watching, listening, working. The realization sent a small chill through her. Not fear, awareness. The house had secrets, real ones, not rumors, not ghost stories. Secrets built directly into its structure. They continued deeper. The passage eventually widened. Ahead, the flashlight illuminated a small hidden chamber, perhaps 6 feet square. No window, no furniture, just shelves, dust, and evidence that somebody had spent considerable time here. A folding chair stood against one wall. Its canvas seat had long since deteriorated. Beside it sat several empty glass jars. Near the floor rested a rusted thermos. The space felt less like storage and more like a lookout, a place where someone worked, or waited, or searched. Eleanor moved carefully through the room. Her flashlight revealed faint markings on the wall. Numbers, dates written in pencil. Most had faded beyond recognition. One remained barely visible. She stared at it. Long after the flashlight moved away, someone had been here. Years after Margaret Mercer disappeared. Years after Samuel supposedly withdrew from the world. The corridor continued beyond the chamber, narrowing once more. Ranger suddenly stopped. His ears rose, his body became rigid. Eleanor followed his gaze. At the far end of the passage stood a metal door. Unlike everything else they had seen, the door was industrial. Gray steel, heavy, deliberately installed. A small lock remained mounted beside the handle. The steel surface showed patches of rust, but the structure itself remained intact, solid, permanent. It looked completely out of place inside a hidden corridor, which made it even more unsettling. Ranger approached carefully, sniffed, then sat. The gesture felt significant, almost ceremonial, as if he had finally reached the destination he had been trying to show her all along. Eleanor stepped closer. The flashlight illuminated the lock. Dust covered most surfaces, but not all. Something caught her attention. The handle. Unlike everything surrounding it, the handle showed almost no corrosion. She leaned closer. Someone had used it repeatedly. Long after the rest of the passage had aged, the metal carried subtle wear patterns. A detail easy to miss, impossible to ignore once seen. Her heartbeat quickened. The corridor seemed smaller suddenly, the air heavier. Questions crowded her mind. Who built this place? Why hide it? Why keep using it? And most importantly, what was behind that door? Eleanor reached toward the handle, then stopped. The lock remained engaged. The mechanism looked old but functional. Without a key or proper tools, forcing it risked damaging whatever might lie beyond. She lowered her hand. Not yet. Ranger looked up at her, then back at the door. The message was unmistakable. They had found something. Something real, something important. But not everything. Not yet. Eleanor slowly exhaled. The flashlight beam lingered on the steel surface. The hidden corridor stretched silently behind them. And somewhere beyond the locked metal door, untouched by time and hidden inside the walls of the house, everyone avoided. Another piece of the story waited to be uncovered. Eleanor stood before the steel door for nearly a minute. The flashlight beam trembled slightly in her hand. Not from fear, from anticipation. The feeling reminded her of opening a letter she wasn't sure she wanted to read. Some part of her already understood that whatever lay beyond this door would change how she saw the house. Perhaps how she saw the town. Maybe even how she saw herself. Ranger sat patiently beside her. Watching, waiting, the dog had led her this far. Now the next move belonged to her. She examined the lock more closely. Old, but not ancient. Unlike the rest of the hidden corridor, this mechanism appeared maintained. Someone had cared enough to preserve it. That detail bothered her, because it suggested intention. The house had not merely hidden this place. Someone had wanted it hidden. The following morning, Eleanor returned with tools, a flashlight, work gloves, a small toolbox, and a determination she hadn't felt in years. The lock resisted, not dramatically, just stubbornly. After nearly an hour of careful work, the mechanism finally released with a metallic click that echoed through the narrow passage. The sound seemed unnaturally loud, as though the house itself had heard it. Eleanor slowly pulled the handle. The hinges groaned. Dust drifted through the flashlight beam. Then the door opened. The room beyond was larger than she expected, much larger. Not a storage closet, not a maintenance chamber, a workspace. The ceiling was low, the walls unfinished, but everything else felt deliberate, purposeful, organized. A narrow desk stretched across one side of the room. Shelves covered the opposite wall. Metal filing cabinets stood in neat rows. Stacks of notebooks occupied every available surface. Boxes labeled by year filled entire sections of shelving. For several moments, Eleanor simply stared. The room looked less like a secret hiding place and more like an archive, a life's work preserved underground. Ranger entered first. His nails clicked softly against the floor. The dog sniffed carefully, then relaxed. For the first time in weeks, he seemed satisfied, as if he had finally found what he had been searching for. Eleanor moved toward the nearest shelf. Her flashlight swept across handwritten labels. Year after year, dozens of them. She pulled one notebook free. The cover was worn leather, the pages yellowed with age. Written across the front in precise block letters were two words: Samuel Mercer. Eleanor sat slowly at the desk, opened the notebook, and began reading. The handwriting was meticulous, every line neat, every entry dated. The first pages contained weather observations, wind direction, tide levels, visibility reports, technical notes, nothing unusual. But as the entries progressed, another pattern emerged. Names, conversations, questions, observations. Dates cross-referenced against newspaper articles, witness statements, official reports. Samuel had documented everything. The level of detail was astonishing. Not the work of a confused man, not the writings of someone losing touch with reality. The opposite: methodical, disciplined, patient. The realization unsettled Eleanor, because the stories she had heard around town described a lonely man consumed by grief, a man chasing ghosts, yet the pages before her told a different story entirely. Hours passed. The afternoon light outside faded. Eleanor barely noticed. Notebook after notebook revealed the same pattern: investigation, research, documentation, careful analysis. Samuel Mercer had spent years studying one event, one mystery, one unanswered question. What happened to Margaret Mercer, his wife, the woman who disappeared during the rescue operation in 1967? At first, the entries focused on grief, loss, confusion, questions. Then gradually the tone changed. The deeper Samuel looked, the more inconsistencies he discovered. Different reports contained different timelines. Witness accounts contradicted one another. Recorded weather conditions failed to match certain official statements. Small discrepancies, individually meaningless, together impossible to ignore. Eleanor leaned back slowly. The room suddenly felt colder. She reached for another notebook, then another. The evidence accumulated relentlessly, not dramatic revelations, something more persuasive: facts, details, questions left unanswered, and always the same conclusion appearing in Samuel's notes. The official story does not fit the evidence. Outside, darkness settled across the bluff. The ocean roared faintly beyond the walls. Inside the hidden room, Eleanor continued reading. Ranger slept nearby, occasionally lifting his head when she moved, then settling again. Near midnight, she discovered a row of cardboard boxes stacked beneath one shelf. Inside were reel-to-reel tapes, dozens of them, each carefully labeled. Interview 1972, Harbor Witness, Weather Office, Rescue Crew, County Records. The labels alone raised more questions than answers. The following day, she borrowed an old reel-to-reel player from a retired radio technician in town. By afternoon, she sat once again inside Samuel's hidden archive. Listening, a soft hiss filled the speaker. Then a voice, Samuel's voice, older than she expected, calm, measured, thoughtful. Interview recorded June 14, 1972. The recording continued. Questions, answers, memories. Witnesses describing details that never appeared in official reports. The quality varied. Some recordings were difficult to hear, others remarkably clear. But one thing remained constant. Samuel approached every conversation like an engineer. Careful, precise, systematic. Not emotional, not irrational. Searching, always searching. By the end of the week, Eleanor had read dozens of journals, listened to countless recordings, studied maps, weather charts, harbor records, engineering diagrams, and a completely different picture had emerged. The town had remembered Samuel Mercer incorrectly, not maliciously. simply incompletely. People remembered the lonely man walking alone near the cliffs, the notebooks, the questions, the obsession. What they forgot was the discipline behind it, the intelligence, the evidence. One evening, Eleanor drove into town and stopped at Claire's bakery. Claire immediately noticed the exhaustion in her face. "You look worse than last week." Eleanor laughed softly. "Thanks, you know what I mean." Claire poured coffee, set it down, then waited. Eleanor stared into the cup for a moment. Finally, she spoke. "I found something in the house." Claire's expression sharpened. "What kind of something?" "A hidden room." The bakery fell silent. Not completely, but enough. Claire stopped moving. A customer looked up briefly, then returned to his newspaper. "A hidden room?" Eleanor nodded. "Samuel's records." Claire sat across from her, slowly. "What records?" Eleanor considered how to explain, then chose the simplest answer. "Everything." The word hung between them. Claire studied her face carefully. "What did he find?" Eleanor looked through the front window. Rain drifted across the street outside. The sky darkened over the harbor. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "I don't think Samuel Mercer spent 20 years chasing a ghost." Claire frowned. "What do you mean?" Eleanor met her eyes. "I think he spent 20 years collecting evidence." Neither woman spoke for several seconds. The bakery's warm lighting suddenly felt far away. The smell of bread, the clatter of dishes, the ordinary sounds of life, all of it seemed distant. Because something fundamental had shifted. The house was no longer simply mysterious, no longer merely strange. The hidden corridor, the secret room, the journals, the recordings, the years of documentation. A new possibility had emerged, one far more compelling than any ghost story, far more unsettling than any rumor. The house everyone avoided had never been protecting a legend. It had been protecting evidence. And somewhere inside, Samuel Mercer's mountain of records, the truth about Margaret's disappearance was still waiting to be found. The realization followed Eleanor everywhere. Into the kitchen, onto the porch, down the winding road into Windhaven, even into her dreams. The house felt different now. Not haunted, not cursed, occupied. Occupied by a purpose she had only begun to understand. Every morning she carried coffee into the hidden archive and spent hours sorting through Samuel's records, journals, maps, interview transcripts, engineering notes, letters. The sheer volume of material was staggering. No one could have assembled such a collection accidentally. This had been the work of decades, and Samuel had done it almost entirely alone. Ranger stayed close, always, sometimes sleeping beside the desk, sometimes wandering through the corridor, occasionally disappearing into the darkness for several minutes before returning. The dog seemed increasingly comfortable in the hidden spaces, as though the mystery that once disturbed him had become familiar. One rainy afternoon, Eleanor found herself reading Samuel's notes from 1981. A pattern immediately caught her attention. Repeated references to previous property owners, not Samuel, the people who came after him. Names, dates, observations. Some entries contained only a few sentences. Others filled entire pages. Eleanor frowned. That wasn't what she expected. She continued reading. An hour later, she understood why. Samuel had predicted it. The departures, the fear, the rumors, everything. The discovery left her staring at the page for a long time. Because decades earlier, Samuel had written words that sounded remarkably familiar. People hear sounds they cannot explain. They leave before they understand them. The sentence appeared in one journal, then again in another, and another. The more Eleanor read, the clearer the picture became. The house itself had created the mystery, not intentionally, mechanically. The hidden corridor contained an extensive network of ventilation shafts and maintenance channels built into the structure. During storms, ocean winds traveled through the concealed spaces. Air moved between walls, across old ducts, through forgotten openings, creating sounds, footsteps, knocks, metallic echoes, low voices. Not supernatural, acoustic, perfectly explainable if you knew where to look, but nobody had. At least not long enough. One owner heard footsteps during winter storms and sold the property 6 months later. Another became convinced someone entered the house at night. A third reported hearing faint conversations inside empty rooms. Each story grew. Each owner left, and each departure strengthened the house's reputation. Fear built upon fear, rumor upon rumor, until eventually the legend became stronger than the truth. Eleanor sat back slowly. Outside, rain streaked the windows. The ocean beyond the bluff disappeared into gray mist. The entire situation felt strangely sad. People hadn't been driven away by danger. They had been driven away by misunderstanding. A soft thump interrupted her thoughts. Ranger. The dog stood near the far side of the archive. His ears pointed forward, his body alert. Eleanor smiled. You found something? Ranger immediately looked toward the wall behind him, then back at her. The same behavior that had led her to the hidden corridor. The same insistence, the same certainty. Eleanor stood. The dog moved aside. A built-in storage cabinet occupied the corner. She had seen it dozens of times. A simple wooden structure attached directly to the wall. Unremarkable, forgettable, which suddenly made it suspicious. She approached. The cabinet contained several empty shelves. Nothing unusual. Dust coated every surface. She checked the back panel. Solid, or so it appeared. Ranger pressed his nose against the lower section, then pawed gently, not frantically, deliberately. The movement instantly captured Eleanor's attention. She crouched, examined the cabinet more carefully. The lower shelf sat slightly deeper than the others, perhaps half an inch, maybe less. The difference was subtle, easy to overlook, unless a German shepherd refused to stop pointing at it. Eleanor laughed softly. You're becoming very hard to ignore. Ranger's tail moved once. She reached inside, ran her fingers along the wood and felt it. A narrow gap, hidden beneath decades of dust. Her pulse quickened again. The house seemed determined to reveal itself one layer at a time. She fetched a flashlight, returned, and carefully examined the seam. The panel blended almost perfectly with the surrounding wood. Someone had designed it that way. She pressed gently. Nothing. She tried again. Still nothing. Then she noticed a tiny metal catch concealed beneath the shelf support. A mechanism. Simple, ingenious, invisible. The moment she released it, the entire lower panel shifted inward. A soft click echoed through the room. The hidden compartment slowly opened. Cool air drifted out. Eleanor's heartbeat accelerated. Not fear, expectation. Inside rested a single object. Nothing else, no stacks of records. No boxes, no valuables, just one package. Wrapped carefully in oilcloth, protected from moisture, protected from time. Waiting, Ranger sat beside her, watching quietly, almost solemnly. The package measured roughly 12 inches long and 4 inches thick. A faded label remained attached to the surface. The handwriting had aged, but remained legible. Eleanor read it twice, then a third time. To whoever chooses to stay. The words seemed to absorb the sound in the room. Everything became still. The ocean, the rain, the house. Even her thoughts. To whoever chooses to stay. Not to a family member, not to an investigator, not to a friend, to whoever stayed. The phrase carried an unexpected weight, because suddenly Eleanor understood something. The package had never been intended for a specific person. Samuel had left it for someone like her, someone patient enough, curious enough, stubborn enough to remain. For several moments she simply stared. Then she carefully lifted the package from the compartment. It felt heavier than expected. Substantial, important. The oilcloth crackled softly beneath her fingers. Ranger rose immediately. The dog followed as she carried it to the desk. Rain continued tapping against the distant walls of the house. The hidden archive felt smaller now, more intimate, like a conversation across time. Eleanor placed the package beneath the desk lamp. The yellow light illuminated the faded handwriting. To whoever chooses to stay. A lump formed unexpectedly in her throat. Not because she knew what was inside, because she didn't. The mystery had carried her this far. The hidden corridor, the archive, Samuel's journals, the evidence, the stories, and now this. Something Samuel himself had deliberately hidden. Something important enough to separate from everything else. She carefully loosened the old wrapping cord. The knot resisted briefly, then released. The oilcloth unfolded. Inside rested a sealed document envelope, several photographs, and what appeared to be a small audio cassette labeled simply, "Final Recording." Eleanor froze. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Ranger lowered himself beside the desk, resting his head across his paws, watching, waiting. The envelope remained unopened, the photographs untouched, the cassette unexplored. Yet somehow she already knew. This was it. Not the complete answer, but the missing piece, the thing Samuel had searched for, the thing the records had been building toward for decades, the thing every previous owner had come close to finding and never reached. Outside, another wave struck the cliffs below. The sound rolled through the bluff, deep, ancient, steady. Inside the hidden room, Eleanor looked at the package resting beneath the lamp, and, for the first time since arriving in Windhaven, she understood why the house had never truly frightened her. It wasn't trying to scare people away. It was trying to be understood. And after decades of waiting, Ranger had just uncovered the one thing Samuel Mercer most wanted someone to find. The rain had stopped sometime during the evening. Outside, moonlight drifted through breaks in the clouds. The Pacific stretched beyond the bluff like dark liquid silver. Inside the hidden archive, Eleanor sat alone beneath the desk lamp. The sealed envelope rested before her. The photographs lay untouched. The cassette remained inside its faded paper sleeve. Ranger slept nearby, one ear twitching occasionally. His work, it seemed, was finally done, for now. Eleanor reached for the envelope first. The paper felt brittle, carefully preserved, carefully hidden. She opened it slowly. Inside were copies of official reports, witness statements, newspaper clippings, photographs from the rescue operation, and a handwritten note from Samuel. The handwriting matched the journals, precise, controlled, steady. The note contained only one sentence. "If you are reading this, you finally have everything I never did." Eleanor stared at the words, then looked at the photographs. Most showed fishing boats, storm damage, coastline images, rescue crews. Nothing remarkable, until one image caught her attention. A black and white photograph taken near the harbor in 1967. Several fishermen stood beside a damaged vessel, wrapped in blankets, exhausted, alive. On the edge of the frame stood a woman, Margaret Mercer. Eleanor recognized her immediately from other photographs in Samuel's records. She appeared soaked, tired, but smiling. The picture had been taken only hours before she disappeared. Eleanor studied it carefully, then noticed writing on the back. 3 names, a date, and one sentence: "Lives saved before sunrise." The phrase lingered in her mind. She continued reading. The reports told a story very different from the one most people remembered. The storm of 1967 had been one of the worst in decades. A fishing vessel carrying several local men had lost power offshore. Waves pushed it toward rocks. Visibility vanished. The Coast Guard launched a rescue operation. So did volunteers. Among them were Samuel and Margaret. Margaret had extensive maritime rescue training, something Samuel documented repeatedly. She was experienced, respected, trusted, yet almost nobody in town seemed to remember that. Eleanor moved to the witness statements, one after another, different voices, different perspectives, but a pattern emerged. Every fisherman rescued that night credited Margaret with helping save lives. One statement described her entering freezing water to secure a rescue line. Another described her coordinating communications when equipment failed. A third credited her with preventing panic aboard the damaged vessel. Eleanor slowly lowered the page. The woman described in these accounts wasn't a victim. She was a hero. The realization hit harder than expected, because nowhere in the official summary was that role emphasized. The final report described Margaret's disappearance, the weather, the search, the outcome, but not the lives she helped save, not the courage, not the sacrifice, not the people who went home because she was there. Those details faded over time, buried beneath paperwork, lost beneath decades of retelling. Eleanor reached for the cassette. The label read, "Final recording." She borrowed the old player from the shelf beside the desk, inserted the tape, pressed play. Static filled the room. Then Samuel's voice emerged. Older now, softer, the voice of a man carrying years of unfinished grief. To whoever finds this, the tape crackled briefly, then continued. "If you're listening, it means you stayed longer than most." Eleanor glanced toward Ranger. The dog remained asleep. Samuel's voice filled the room. "I don't know your name." A pause. "I don't know when you're hearing this." Another pause. "But I know why you're here." The recording continued. Samuel explained that for decades he searched for proof, not because he believed Margaret survived, not because he couldn't accept her loss, but because the story everyone remembered was incomplete. "The town remembers a disappearance," he said. "They forgot a sacrifice." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. Samuel described interviewing fishermen, reviewing reports, comparing records, tracking witnesses, collecting photographs, not to solve a mystery, to preserve a truth. The people she saved grew older. His voice trembled slightly. Their children grew older. The town changed. People moved away. People died. And every year, fewer people remembered what she actually did. The room seemed impossibly quiet. Even the ocean felt distant. Samuel continued. The tragedy remained. The courage disappeared. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. The words landed heavily, not because they were dramatic, because they felt honest, deeply honest. The tape reached its final minutes. "If you found this package, then you found what I never could." A pause. Longer this time. The complete record. Another crackle. "Then please don't let her be forgotten." Silence followed. The tape ended. The reels stopped turning. Eleanor sat motionless. For several minutes, she did not move. The room felt different now. Not mysterious, heartbroken. The hidden archive no longer resembled an investigation. It resembled devotion. A husband refusing to let history reduce his wife to a footnote. A man preserving evidence because memory alone was not enough. Ranger slowly lifted his head, walked across the room, and rested his muzzle against Eleanor's knee. She smiled weakly, then scratched behind his ears. "You found it." The dog blinked. Nothing more. Yet somehow the gesture felt important. The following morning, Eleanor drove directly to Windhaven's Historical Society. The small archive occupied 2 rooms behind the public library. Dusty shelves, old photographs, boxes of local records. The volunteer curator, an elderly woman named Judith Crane, greeted her warmly. Eleanor spent hours comparing Samuel's materials against town records. The results were astonishing. Every major detail matched: names, dates, witnesses, locations. The evidence was overwhelming. Margaret Mercer had played a central role in the rescue operation. Multiple families owed their existence to decisions she made that night. Yet over time, the town remembered only the loss, not the heroism. The tragedy survived. The sacrifice faded. When Eleanor finally left the archive, the sun was setting. Orange light spread across the harbor. Fishing boats rocked gently at their moorings. People moved along sidewalks carrying groceries and coffee. Ordinary life, the kind Margaret had helped preserve. The realization followed Eleanor home. By the time she reached the bluff, she understood something Samuel had spent decades trying to say. The house was never cursed, not even slightly. The sounds, the rumors, the departures, the mystery, none of it explained why the house endured. The real reason lay elsewhere. The house remained because Samuel made it a vessel, a keeper of memory. a place where truth could survive until someone cared enough to uncover it. Eleanor stood on the porch overlooking the ocean. The wind carried salt and distant fog. Ranger sat beside her. The house behind them glowed softly in the evening light. For weeks she had wondered why she felt drawn to this place, why it felt familiar despite being entirely new. Now she finally understood. The house wasn't waiting for answers. The answers had always been here. It was waiting for someone willing to listen, and thanks to an aging German shepherd who refused to ignore a wall, the final missing piece had finally come to light. Far below, waves struck the cliffs, steady, endless, like time itself, and for the first time in more than 50 years, Margaret Mercer's story was finally complete. The realization stayed with Eleanor for days. Not as excitement, not even as satisfaction. It felt quieter than that. Like a room inside her had finally stopped echoing. The hidden corridor no longer frightened her. The journals no longer felt mysterious. The house itself seemed different. The same cedar walls, the same winds rattling the windows at night, the same distant roar of the Pacific below the bluff, yet somehow lighter, as if a burden carried by the house for decades had finally been set down. One morning, Eleanor sat at the bakery with Claire. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The smell of cinnamon rolls drifted from the kitchen. A few fishermen occupied a table near the door. Their boots left damp marks across the floor. Claire refilled Eleanor's coffee. "You look different," she said. Eleanor smiled. "Do I? You do." Claire leaned against the counter. "So," a pause. "Did you figure it out?" Eleanor looked out the window. For a long moment, she simply watched rain slide down the glass. Then she nodded. Most of it. Claire waited. The town had taught her patience. Eventually, Eleanor said, "The house wasn't hiding something dangerous." Claire raised an eyebrow. "No, no. What was it hiding?" Eleanor looked back at her. "A story." Claire laughed softly. "That sounds like something Samuel Mercer would have said." The words lingered between them. Then Eleanor reached into her bag. She placed a photograph on the counter. Margaret Mercer, smiling beside the rescued fisherman. Claire stared. Her expression slowly changed. Confusion first, then recognition, then something else, something deeper. "My grandfather is in this picture." Eleanor looked closer. An older fisherman stood near the edge of the frame. "You knew?" Claire shook her head. "No." Her voice had become almost a whisper. "I knew he survived a storm." She swallowed. "I never knew who helped save him." For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Outside, the rain continued falling. Inside the bakery, something important had quietly shifted. Word spread faster than Eleanor expected. Small towns often worked that way. One conversation became three became 10. Within 2 weeks, people began arriving at the house. At first, only a handful. An elderly retired fisherman named Walter Briggs, a former harbor dispatcher, a woman who remembered hearing stories about Margaret as a child. They came carrying memories, photographs, scrapbooks, boxes stored in attics, stories told by parents and grandparents. Each visitor seemed to bring one missing piece, a face, a date, a detail. Together, those fragments slowly formed a larger picture. The community began rebuilding a history it hadn't realized was incomplete. Ranger watched it all, usually from the porch, sometimes from beneath Eleanor's kitchen table. Visitors quickly fell in love with him, children especially. They asked whether he was the dog who found the secret. Claire started calling him Professor Ranger. The nickname spread. Soon half the town was using it. Ranger accepted the attention with remarkable dignity, as if discovering hidden archives inside walls was simply part of an ordinary week. One Saturday afternoon, a local historian named Daniel Price arrived, carrying 3 archive boxes. He was in his 70s, thin, gray-haired, always slightly out of breath. The kind of man who seemed permanently surrounded by paper. The moment he entered the living room, he stopped, looked around, then smiled. "I never thought I'd see people in this house again." Eleanor offered coffee. He accepted immediately. Historians, she learned, rarely declined free coffee. For 6 hours they worked through documents together, comparing dates, matching photographs, building timelines. Samuel's records connected perfectly with town archives. The evidence was overwhelming. Margaret Mercer had played a critical role in the rescue operation. Yet over decades, the details had simply faded, not through conspiracy, not through malice, through time. Memory eroded. People moved away. Witnesses died. Stories shortened. Eventually, the disappearance remained. The sacrifice disappeared. Daniel sat back in his chair near sunset. The living room glowed amber beneath the lamps. "You know what you've done here?" he asked. Eleanor shook her head. "I don't think I have," he smiled. "You gave a town back part of itself." The comment stayed with her long after he left. The developers arrived next. Not historians, not fishermen, not families, developers. One in particular, a polished man from Portland named Victor Hale. He drove a luxury SUV, wore expensive jackets, and saw opportunity everywhere, especially near the ocean. Victor walked the property one bright afternoon, hands in pockets, eyes constantly measuring, evaluating, calculating. When he finally spoke, his offer surprised Eleanor. It was far higher than she expected, higher than anything she had imagined when she bought the house. "You could retire comfortably," Victor said. Eleanor looked toward the bluff. The sea stretched endlessly beyond the cliffs. "I already retired." Victor laughed politely. "I mean really retire," she smiled. "I know what you meant." He waited, she continued, watching the ocean. The answer arrived naturally, without effort, without hesitation. "No." Victor seemed surprised. "I haven't even told you the final number. You don't need to." He looked around. At the old cedar house, at Ranger lying beside the porch steps, at the visitors arriving down the gravel drive carrying another box of photographs. Eventually he nodded, perhaps understanding, perhaps not. Then he left and never returned. Summer arrived. The coastal fog grew thinner. Wildflowers appeared along the bluff. The house became busier than anyone could remember. Visitors came from neighboring towns. Former residents returned. Newspaper articles appeared. Nothing sensational, nothing dramatic. Simply the story of a forgotten rescue finally being remembered. Claire helped organize community gatherings. Tables appeared on the lawn. Families brought food. Children chased each other across the grass. Older residents shared stories beneath folding canopies. One evening, Eleanor stood on the porch watching nearly 50 people gathered around the property. Laughter drifted through the air. Someone played guitar near the fence. The smell of grilled salmon mixed with ocean wind. Ranger wandered happily from group to group collecting attention. His tail never stopped moving. Claire appeared beside Eleanor carrying lemonade. "You know," she said. "What? This might be the busiest this house has ever been." Eleanor laughed softly. "I was thinking the same thing." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the crowd, watching life, watching something once abandoned become part of the community again. As twilight settled over the bluff, Eleanor noticed something she hadn't expected. For months she had referred to the property as the house. The house, the old place, Samuel's house, Margaret's house, never hers. But standing there now, listening to conversations drifting through open windows, she realized the wording had quietly changed inside her mind. Without noticing, without deciding, without effort, it had become home. Not because she owned it, not because she restored it, not because she solved its mystery, because she belonged there. The realization surprised her and comforted her. The house everyone avoided no longer felt isolated. The silence that once defined it had been replaced by voices, by stories, by memory, by connection. And somewhere beneath the floorboards and behind the walls, the hidden corridor remained. No longer a source of fear, no longer a source of rumors, simply part of the house's history. A passage that had protected the truth until someone stayed long enough to find it. As darkness settled over the Pacific, and lights began glowing warmly through the old cedar windows. Eleanor sat beside Ranger on the porch. People were still talking below, children still laughing, neighbors still sharing stories. She rested one hand against Ranger's shoulder. The dog leaned gently against her leg. And for the first time since arriving in Oregon with a suitcase full of photographs and a future she could not imagine, Eleanor realized she wasn't merely living in the house anymore. She had become part of its story, and somehow, it had become part of hers. A year passed, not all at once, not in dramatic leaps, in mornings, in seasons, in small routines that quietly became a life. The Oregon coast moved through its familiar cycle. Winter storms rattled the bluff. Spring fog drifted through the cedar trees. Summer sunlight stretched long across the ocean. Autumn rains returned, and through it all, the old house remained. Steady, alive, no longer avoided, no longer feared. One bright September morning, Eleanor stepped onto the porch, carrying a mug of coffee. The air smelled of salt and damp earth. Far below, waves rolled toward the cliffs in slow silver lines. Ranger followed her outside. His muzzle had become a little grayer during the year, his pace a little slower, but his eyes remained the same. Alert, gentle, content. He settled beside the porch steps and watched the morning wake up. Visitors would arrive soon. They always did. Some came because of the history, others because of the mystery. Many came because they had heard about the dog who found the hidden corridor, the dog who uncovered the package, the dog who solved the story. Ranger accepted his local celebrity status with remarkable humility, mostly because he seemed unaware of it. Eleanor smiled, then headed inside. The house had changed over the past year, not structurally, emotionally. The living room now displayed photographs of Samuel and Margaret Mercer, framed newspaper articles, maps from the rescue operation, copies of witness accounts. The once empty rooms now carried voices, questions, conversations, memory. Near the hallway entrance stood a simple plaque. It read, Margaret Mercer, 1934-1967. Her courage saved lives. Her story saved none until it was remembered. Visitors often paused there, sometimes for seconds, sometimes for much longer. By noon, the house was busy. Families wandered through the rooms. Children asked questions. Retired fishermen shared stories. A group from Portland studied the archive display. Claire moved through the crowd helping visitors. As she often did, the bakery remained successful. The friendship remained stronger. Some things simply found their proper place. Daniel Price still visited twice a month. The Historical Society had officially added Margaret's rescue records to the town archive. Local schools now included the story in community history projects. A scholarship had even been created in her name for students pursuing maritime, safety and rescue studies. None of it had happened quickly. All of it had happened naturally. One person remembered, then another, then another. Memory returned, like a tide. Late in the afternoon, Eleanor slipped away from the crowd. She followed a narrow path behind the house, past wind-shaped shrubs, past tall grass swaying in the ocean breeze, toward a wooden bench overlooking the Pacific, her favorite place, the same place she visited nearly every day. The bench sat near the edge of the bluff, safe, quiet, facing west. On clear evenings, the horizon seemed endless. Today, a thin layer of fog floated offshore, white and soft beneath the sunlight. Ranger followed. Of course he did. He always followed. The dog settled beside the bench with a contented sigh. Eleanor sat, coffee warming her hands, ocean before her, the house behind her. For a while, she simply watched the water. She had grown fond of silence again. Not the lonely silence she remembered from before. Not the silence of loss. A different kind, the peaceful kind. The kind that feels earned. Footsteps approached, small footsteps. A child, Eleanor, turned. A girl around 10 years old stood near the path. Freckles, dark hair, a notebook tucked beneath one arm. One of the visitors. The girl hesitated, smiled. Hi. The girl glanced toward Ranger. then toward the house, then back to Eleanor. My teacher brought us here. Eleanor nodded. Did you like it? The girl looked toward the ocean. It's really cool. The answer made Eleanor laugh softly. Children often found simpler ways to tell the truth. The girl shifted slightly, then asked a question, a simple question, the kind that arrives without warning, the kind that matters. Why did you stay? Eleanor looked at her. The wind moved gently through the grass. Behind them, the old house stood glowing in late afternoon sunlight. Visitors moved between rooms. Voices drifted faintly through open windows. For a moment, Eleanor didn't answer. Not because she didn't know, because she did. She simply wanted the words to arrive honestly. The girl waited, patient, curious. Ranger lifted his head, watching, listening. Eleanor turned toward the ocean, toward the horizon, toward the fog drifting above the water. A year earlier, she had arrived carrying little more than a suitcase, a handful of photographs, and a German shepherd. She remembered that woman, tired, uncertain, trying not to look too far ahead. At the time, she believed she was searching for a house, a place to live, a place to start over, a place to survive. But that wasn't what happened. Not really. The house had given her something else, something she hadn't known she needed. A reason, a purpose, a direction. The forgotten story she helped restore had restored something inside her too. Not youth, not lost years. Something more important. Belonging. She finally spoke. When I got here, she said softly, I thought I was looking for a place to live. The girl listened carefully. Eleanor smiled. But I found something better. What? Eleanor glanced toward Ranger. The dog blinked slowly, then looked back toward the sea. She laughed. Even now, he seemed perfectly comfortable, allowing others to explain his work. I found a reason to keep moving forward. The girl considered that, then nodded, as if she understood more than most adults might. After a moment, she smiled. That's a good reason. Then she waved and headed back toward the house. Eleanor watched her go. The notebook bounced against the girl's side with each step. Soon, she disappeared through the front door. The house welcomed her inside, just as it welcomed everyone now. Silence returned, soft, comfortable. The fog offshore slowly shifted, opening a wider view of the horizon. Ranger rose and rested his head against Eleanor's knee. She scratched behind his ears, the familiar gesture, the one that had accompanied almost every chapter of this journey. Neither of them had known what waited behind those walls. Neither of them had understood why the house felt different. Yet somehow they had stayed. Long enough to listen, long enough to understand, long enough to uncover what everyone else had missed. The house everyone avoided had never been cursed. It had never wanted people to leave. It had been waiting, waiting for patience, waiting for courage, waiting for someone willing to stay when fear told them to go, waiting for someone willing to look beyond rumors, beyond assumptions, beyond appearances. Eleanor looked toward the old cedar house. Sunlight reflected from the windows. Laughter drifted from the porch. Life moved through its rooms again. And for the first time in many years, perhaps for the first time in decades, the house felt exactly what it had been built to be. A home. Not just for memories, for people, for stories, for second chances. The wind strengthened briefly, carrying the scent of the Pacific, the scent of cedar, the scent of rain somewhere far offshore. Eleanor closed her eyes and breathed deeply, then opened them again. The horizon stretched endlessly before her, clear beyond the fog, and in that moment she understood something simple. People often walk away from what they do not understand. Places, histories, even other people. Sometimes the greatest value remains hidden beneath fear, misunderstanding, and time. Patience reveals what rushing cannot. Courage reveals what fear conceals. And loyalty, sometimes carried quietly by an old German shepherd, can uncover truths powerful enough to change not only what we see, but who we become. Beside her, Ranger rested peacefully. Ahead of her, the ocean stretched forever. Behind her, the house everyone avoided stood full of life, And Eleanor Whitaker finally felt exactly where she belonged. The end. And Eleanor Whitaker finally felt exactly where she belonged. The end. Or maybe not quite. Because a few minutes later, after the visitors had gone home and the last voices had faded from the porch, Eleanor remained on that bench overlooking the Pacific. Ranger rested beside her, the same dog who had refused to walk past a wall, the same dog who kept returning to a place everyone else ignored. Not because he understood hidden corridors, not because he knew anything about Margaret Mercer. He simply knew something wasn't finished, and he wouldn't let it go. Eleanor looked toward the house one more time. When she first arrived, she thought she was the one rescuing it. An abandoned house, a forgotten story, a mystery nobody wanted. But sitting there now, she realized something that took her an entire year to understand. The house had rescued her, too.
Not with money, not with answers, with purpose, because after losing so much, she had quietly started believing her most meaningful chapters were behind her. Then a dog scratched at a wall, and behind that wall was a woman history had forgotten. A man who refused to stop remembering, and a reason to keep waking up each morning. Funny how life works sometimes. The thing that changes everything isn't always hidden in the vault or buried underground. Sometimes it's waiting in a place everyone else gives up on. A house, a story, a person, even yourself. The fog reached across the horizon. The old cedar house stood warm against the evening light, and for the first time in decades, nobody were avoiding it anymore. They were coming home to it. So before you leave, think about it. What if the thing you've been ready to walk away from is simply waiting for you to stay long enough to understand it?